Jack Eaton Sr. agreed to let his son go on a school trip to another country with his favorite teacher and 26 other boys. But he never imagined how much he would come to regret that decision. After he lost his son on a mountain in Germany, he spent every waking moment trying to make the teacher responsible pay. But between the teacher wanting to avoid trouble himself, government officials scared to damage delicate relations, and Nazis wanting to use the story to their advantage, it would take over 80 years for the truth to come out. I'm Tatiana Bunch, and welcome to Occurrence. This is the story of the English Calamity. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information. Without further ado, Kenneth Keast was a 27-year-old teacher at a boys' grammar school in South London. It was named Strand School. Easter break was around the corner, and all the boys going on the trip were excited to be going with Keast. He was the English, German, and physical education teacher for Strand School, and he was going to be the only adult chaperone for the trip. The trip was set up differently than it normally would have been. Typically, the school would organize the trip, but since Keast was offering it privately, he used a London travel agency called School Travel Service. The plan was for 27 boys between the ages of 12 and 17 to go on a 10-day trip to the Black Forest in Germany. I should note, this is 1936, so it's Nazi Germany. The group made it to Freiburg in Breisgau on April 16th and planned to start the first leg of their hike the next day. When they made it into town, the tourist office warned Keast that a blizzard was coming in. Apparently, he responded saying, "The English are used to sudden changes in the weather." The route Keast planned was 15 miles or 24 kilometers long, and it went 3,300 feet up a mountain. To the locals, even under the best of conditions, it was a very challenging route. They were supposed to start in Freiburg, go over the Schauinsland mountain, then go through the Notschrei mountain pass, before arriving at a different youth hostel called Radshirt in Tottenauberg. The morning they were supposed to leave the youth hostel in Freiburg, a weather report was posted, saying that there would be a change in weather. It was expected to be cold with fog in the morning and a snowstorm later on. Just before they were supposed to leave and start their journey, Keast asked the warden of the hostel and the storekeeper for directions to the Schauinsland mountain. They were in the middle of a conversation when Keast came up to them. When they realized his plan, both men warned him not to use any snow-covered trails, no matter what. They both told him if he was going to go on his journey, then he needed to stick to only the roads that had already been cleared. Both of the men were experienced mountain hikers themselves. So, they started drawing a path on the map Keith already had for him to follow. And they noticed his map was not as detailed as it should have been. The map Keast was using was from the travel agency with a scale of 1 to 100,000. It showed the main trails, but it didn't show the topography, like the elevation, important structures, shortcuts, and, other important details you should know before climbing a mountain, especially with almost 30 kids. But the Black Forest Association published a detailed hiking map Keast could have followed. It had all of the info he needed, so it's unclear why he didn't get one for himself. Once the group moved to leave, the hostel workers noticed the boys were dressed in summer clothing. They were wearing shorts, and some had light jackets and sandals. And they didn't see anyone carrying water. They decided not to say anything because they assumed Keast knew what he was doing. The group walked from the hostel and followed the tram lines almost 2 miles, and then left the cleared roads at a village right at the mountain base. Now, at the bottom of the travel itinerary, there was a note saying they could shorten the amount of time spent walking and the journey overall if they took a tram to the bottom of the mountain or took a cable car to go up the mountain. Instead, they walked from the hostel and followed the tram lines almost 2 miles and then left the clear roads at a village right at the mountain base. During the walk over to the mountain, it started noticeably snowing. Prior to this, there might have been a little precipitation, but now it was full-on snowing, and the snow was sticking. Two employees from the Freiburg bus company see them while they're shoveling snow for the buses. When they leave the cleared roads, Keith takes them to the north. Apparently, this is not the direction he was supposed to go in, and the assumption is that he wanted to try a shortcut. Now, one of the owners of the inn and his son were on their way into town. They wanted to grab more supplies and be better prepared for the storm. They saw Keith's group on their way to town. Keith and the others continued on their way and within 30 minutes were lost. About 3 hours into the hike, they came out of the forest and into a clearing. The snow was still falling, but kids will be kids, and they broke the formation they were walking in and started a snowball fight. Keith took note of their light clothing and that the snow was starting to pick up a bit more, and so he got on them about playing around instead of focusing on the journey ahead of them. A 13-year-old wrote in his notebook something along the lines of, "They had breakfast and left Freiburg at 9 o'clock. Then it was snowing and they got lost." The same boy also sent a postcard home before the hike started. Once they got moving again, they ended up walking in a giant circle and eventually made their way back to the inn. They were behind schedule, so Keist entered the inn and went up to the landlady and asked for directions to the Schauenslin Peak. She was obviously surprised by that question because she asked him, "You want to go up the mountain with all of this snow and with the weather being like this?" And Keist just goes, "Yes." So then the landlady goes, "You picked the longest route going this way, and you're going to get lost in the blizzard." And Keith says, "There's signposts, I can just follow those." And the landlady warns him that by the time he makes it to the area where the posts are, they'll be completely covered in snow. And Keist, clearly not liking this theme of being told it's not a good idea to continue on again, says something along the lines of, "We'll just brush them off." And then he just kind of storms out. The owner and his son came back during that conversation, and when they saw the boys again, they said they had snow all on their heads, and they looked like they were in worse condition because they were so cold. The landlady didn't even realize there were children with Keist until her husband and son came back. All three of them watched the group walk up the slope, and the shorts made an impression on the landlady because she called them little lads in shorts. But the feeling from the family was that they were horrified to watch the group going up the slope. About an hour after leaving the inn, Keist gets lost again, but eventually he leads them around 3 miles, and they pass where 2 signposts were located. It's around 2:30 p.m. when they are literally kicking their way through snow, and they're heading to the most dangerous spot on the mountain. They're on an open hillside and run into 2 woodcutters. The woodcutters stopped working because the weather was getting too bad for them to continue, so they were headed home. Keist asked them if he's on the right path to the mountain peak, and they told Keist not to continue, but he insisted on going to the peak, so they told him to take the path to the left of the valley. The group continued on for another 30 minutes, following the direction of the woodcutters, and the snow is now 2 feet deep and still falling. 2 of the youngest members of the group start complaining about how cold they are, and another boy is starting to slip and stumble around a lot. The blizzard is getting worse, and 15 minutes later, they reach the base of the valley where they run into the local postman. Keist asks him if they were on the right path and how much further it went. The postman tells him, "Yes, you're on the right path to Todnauberg if you keep going, but the weather is so bad you won't make it. You can't keep going. You can try when the weather clears and the visibility is good, but for now you can go to the miner's house." There was a miner's hostel just minutes away that had plenty of space and beds and food for everyone in the group. The postman begged, in the middle of a blizzard, over and over again to Keist. He told him he would not make it through the blizzard. He offered to take them to the miner's hostel. He even offered to guide them to Freiburg, the town they started in. And Keist just responded with a, "We'll manage." The postman would later say that Keist's behavior was irresponsible and senseless, and that he should not have taken one more step towards his destination. But he steps aside, And when he looked at the boys following Keist into certain disaster, he saw how wet they all were and how they all had piles of snow in their hair, and he said they all looked miserable. You could see them suffering. And one of the small ones at the end was hobbling along, barely able to keep up. If the postman saw his own child in that group, he said he would have pulled him from the line and took him home immediately. The teacher could have gone back with him. Instead, he marched the children to their deaths. But Keist wasn't too worried, so they continued on. And at some point, the slippery conditions made him stop and ask each boy how they were doing. A few of them were complaining about the cold, but Keist thought that turning back at that point would be more dangerous than just continuing on to a nearby village named Hofsgrund. He was hoping to find shelter at an inn or a peasant's house. But with the map Keist was using from the school travel service, it didn't show that the steepest and most dangerous part of the mountain was between him and that village. It was literally on the other side of the summit. So they continued on. The mountain face they're on is just under 2,000 feet high with a 70% grade. So there's a slope steepness index, and it's broken up at different levels. You have 0% being level like a flat floor, and then you have anything over 100% being a very steep slope. The section before that is from 70% to 100%, and it's extreme slope or steep slope. So to have children here and in the weather that they're in is just mind-boggling. I know he didn't have the correct map, but seriously, that is just so steep, and the route he's taking actually has them miss the mountain summit by just a little bit. As they're hiking up the mountain, people at the miners' hostel see the group. They notice them stumbling in the distance, going up a bit and then going down and then back up. They are seen very clearly struggling and suffering around 4 p.m., right before they disappear into the forest. An hour later, they made it to the base of the mountain peak, and Strand School's 14-year-old boxing champion, Jack Eaton, collapses. They give him an orange and a piece of cake and told him to buck up. Some of the boys help him continue on while they sing songs as they all keep climbing to the peak. The snow is now up to their waists. When they make it onto the ridge, they aren't protected by a wall of rock anymore, so they're now hit with the full force of the wind. Keist, trying to get away from the wind, turns to the west and quickly gets lost. Had he gone less than a mile to the east, he would have made it to the ridge. He would have been able to take shelter in the summit station. He also would have been going in the right direction to Hofsgrund. The group had been walking for 9 hours now, and 2 of the youngest boys, along with Jack, now had to be carried. 3 others were struggling and getting worse in a hurry. What happened at this point isn't clear, but for some reason, the group separated. Keist later said he sent the older boys off on a well-organized search to find help, but I think it's quietly believed that the older boys abandoned the group to save themselves when the younger ones started holding them back. Keist wasn't leading them in the right direction to begin with, to Hofsgrund, so I think it's safe to say that well-organized was far from the correct description of what happened next. But everyone broke off into 3 or 4 smaller groups and scattered on the mountain in different directions. In those smaller groups, boys started collapsing, and they had to stop to try to revive them. It was after 6 p.m., and it was getting colder and darker as time went on. The older boys were now starting to struggle. Frostbite was affecting everyone, and it seemed like all hope was lost. Now, Hofsgrund was a 300-person village in the Black Forest. It had 1 inn, farmhouses with steep roofs that animals and humans would share during long winters, and 1 church. At 7 p.m., the church rang its bells, and the sound was carried into the wind. Keist heard the bells and told 2 of the older boys still with him to follow the sound down the hill and get help. They passed some of the others still trying to revive the boys that collapsed. Around 8:30 p.m., the 2 boys spotted a farmhouse on the outskirts of Hofsgrund, and they rushed to knock on the door. The villager who lived there had spent the day at home, like most of the villagers. I'll call him B. The boys caught B just in time because he was about to head out to get the weekly bread delivery. He answered the door, and in broken German, the Strand School boy said, 2 men sick on the mountain. B rushed over to the village inn, where he could see lanterns burning and people playing cards inside, and he started banging on the windows. He gathered a group of rescuers, and they threw on their skis and went to the road. A few of the boys were making their way down the hill, but most of them were still spread across the mountainside. Some of the boys who collapsed were covered in snow, and they were barely able to see them. B found 2 more boys lying completely still in the snow. A grocer took one unconscious boy to his shop, and a farmer took another to his farmhouse. They tried to put the boys they found on the skis to use them like stretchers, but the snow was just too deep and powdery. They had to grab a sleigh to drag them down the mountain. They found one boy named Stanley Lyons just 30 feet from the inn. He was likely already dead, but the villagers still tried to save him. And then B and 4 other farmers went further up the mountain, sharing one lamp between them. They found Keast with 2 unconscious boys, and he told them in German how many there were in the group. He was over 40 minutes away from the nearest group members. Now, while this group of villagers was looking for the boys, other villagers joined the search because underneath the blizzard wind, you could hear the rest of the stranded boys screaming and crying for help. The sound could be heard from all over, and another villager followed the sound for 45 minutes, where he found 3 boys suffering and exposed in the cold. The villagers would work until they found every single boy. They were digging and marching through several feet of snow. They were getting soaked from the blizzard and sweating with how hard they were working to save as many as they could. They would be out there until after 11 p.m. There was a doctor on vacation nearby, and they had him help with the more serious cases. Another doctor had to abandon his ambulance and walk his horse through 2 miles of snow up to his chest. By the time medical help did arrive, it was already too late for 2 of the boys, but the villagers were still trying to help keep them alive. One was 13-year-old Peter Ellerkamp, who they believe passed around 7 p.m. while he was next to an older student. The other was 12-year-old Francis Bourdion, who they also believe passed away around 7 p.m. He was next to Keast and an older student. Everyone who wasn't considered to be a serious case was beaten with brooms to get the snow off them and to get their blood flowing. After that, they were allowed to go near a huge wood stove that they had burning. They were wrapped in blankets to keep them warm while they ate and drank coffee. Once they were sure they were stable, they were sent to bed. By the end of the evening, 2 more boys would be dead. 13-year-old Stanley Lyons, who passed at 9 p.m. in the farmhouse, along with 14-year-old Jack Eaton Jr., who was found in the snow next to 2 older boys. They estimate he passed around 6 p.m. He was 2 months away from his 15th birthday. In the morning, when conditions were better, they took 2 boys to the university hospital in Freiburg, since they were still extremely ill. 14-year-olds Arthur Roberts and Roy Witham. Roy never woke up. The doctors did everything they could to save them, but there's only so much you can do for someone who's been in a blizzard for the better part of 12 hours, especially children dressed like they're going on a picnic in a park in the spring. It just makes no sense. And as bad as that is, somehow what happens next is worse. Because after the remains of the boys were put in the cellar of the Hofsgrund village hall, they were sent to Freiburg and laid in the chapel at the main cemetery. The survivors were eventually taken to Freiburg for medical checks, and it wouldn't be until 2 days later that the children were told 5 of their friends were gone, and only one was still fighting for his life. Before that, they all believed they were all fighting for their lives. And they had absolutely no idea that they were about to become the poster children for Nazi propaganda of unimaginable proportions. To set the stage, Hitler rose to power like 3 years before this, and the relationship between Britain and Germany had been strained ever since. Just a few days before this disaster, the British had a funeral for their German ambassador to Britain. The funeral was used as propaganda too, because they had the Nazi symbol on his coffin, which was being escorted by British guardsmen, and people all around were giving the one-hand salute. The ambassador was believed to be the best hopes for keeping peaceful Anglo-German relations, so keep that in mind. Now, to try and beat the breaking news and reassure the parents of the boys that were okay, they had the survivors write a letter home to their parents. most Brits found out about the Black Forest tragedy in the newspaper the next day. And every day after that, for a while, were stories of Boys Blizzard Battle and Saved by the Bell and Rescue Dash. I mean, it was everywhere. The media hounded Keast, trying to get information for their stories, so eventually he caved and started saying whatever he could to cover his behind. He said things like, "I thought there would be a hut, but when we got to the top of the hill, the fog was too thick." And no one in England could ever imagine what that snowstorm was like. And then he started playing the victim by saying he was suffering. They were all suffering. He was crying. Before then, he quickly pivoted to being the hero. He would talk about how he bravely sent the boys down the mountain to get help once he saw the light of Hofsgrund, and how, since some of the boys couldn't keep going themselves, he carried them. He took turns putting them on his back and marching forwards. He told stories about how the boys were listening and no one panicked, and everyone was completely composed. Keast would talk about how no one expected a storm, and it came out of nowhere, and that he put everything he had into stopping the tragedy, and that the reason they were scattered was because once they started dropping, he left the one who couldn't keep going with one or two others until they could all be rescued. He even came up with a story about how when they were coming down the mountain, they couldn't make it because it was so bad that their skis that were over 7 feet long sank and they had to climb down sideways. At the same time, Keast and the boys were still in Freiburg, and German officials wanted to use what happened to their advantage. The leader of the Hitler Youth movement had a wreath from that movement placed on all the coffins of the boys that didn't survive to show their supposed heartfelt and deep sympathy. They also had Hitler Youth stand guard 24/7 over the coffins until they were sent back to Britain. So they capitalized on it and had the youth in their uniforms and symbols watching over the Brits. And then they had thousands of people from Freiburg come and pay their respects, while Keast, 7 of the older boys, and a few British diplomats were there. The youth leader gave a speech about understanding and peace between the English and the Germans, and the entire thing was highly publicized. During that ceremony, the 15 younger boys had to play a game with the older boys from the youth movement. And that was also highly publicized. Now, the Monday after was Hitler's birthday, so it was just another chance to do something big. They had a procession led by local dignitaries that led to the main train station. They formed a guard with hundreds of boys from the Hitler Youth and the girl equivalent called the Union of German Girls to surround the coffins. They had hundreds of Freiburg school children line the route to watch as the coffins were loaded to the train. The surviving boys were loaded onto 2 separate trains with 20 members of the youth movement as it made its way through Germany and to the border. People lined the streets to throw sweets to the boys as they passed through the border of Belgium. At this point, Hitler Youth was taking credit in the rescue too. The mayor of Freiburg wrote to the father of one of the boys who passed, saying, "The boy was sacrificed to be a symbol for why it's important that there's understanding between Germany and Britain." Apparently, Freiburg officials went along with it because they were worried about the disaster ruining tourism in the Black Forest region. It was a popular area for British tourists and schools to visit. Parents of the boys wrote to Hitler thanking him for the send-off, and the German state railways because they waived the fee the families would have had to pay to have the coffins sent home. The coffins were made of Black Forest timber, and they had a wreath from the youth movement and a letter from German officials. Now, while the boys were sent home, Keast stayed in Germany as a guest of the Hitler Youth. He was spotted in a car with the youth movement leader and the state police. He also wrote a letter thanking Hofsgrund that was later published in the newspaper. He said he could never forget their superhuman efforts and everything they did to bring them to safety. It brought Britain closer to a country that it used to be at odds with. And when he finally made it back to London himself, his parents' house was completely surrounded by reporters, so he left. While he was gone, he ended up meeting with another teacher who he fell in love with, and they would write letters back and forth. In one of his letters, he complained that he wasn't able to sleep, but he thanked her for bringing him whatever sanity he could find. He also said that in spite of everything, that was the happiest day of his life. Over the next few days, the boys were buried, including Jack Eaton Jr., who had thousands of mourners. His father, Jack Sr., along with more than a few locals, didn't really believe the story Keast was telling. Jack Sr. was a self-made man and proud of his successful construction business. He loved his son. He said that Jack was everything he wanted to be. The day after the disaster, he grabbed a solicitor and an interpreter and made his way to Freiburg. He followed the same path as the boys and interviewed rescuers and other witnesses. He even got the map Keast used from the public prosecutor. Everyone told him how they repeatedly told Keast to turn back, and he never did, and it all just made Jack Sr. swear that he wouldn't stop until there was a proper investigation into what really happened in the Black Forest. He wrote a 10-page report of his investigation into the disaster and called it Black Forest Tragedy, The Truth. He sent it to newspapers, politicians, and every single family involved in what happened. He was determined to fight until the end for his son, along with the other boys who should have come home. Jack Sr. believed that everyone probably would have died if it wasn't for the church bells of Hofsgrund, and I think I agree. He also said Keast was very open about his dislike of Germans, and that it's probably what made him feel like it was beneath him to accept a German's word of advice. By all appearances, at least publicly, Jack Sr. was the only person actively trying to have an investigation. But privately, it seems like officials knew that there was more to the story that they just didn't want to let out. 10 days after the disaster, a British official wrote to the Foreign Office saying that he had doubts about Keast's conduct on the tour and felt it deserved to be looked into. He said that it probably would have been avoided if Keast had actually been in touch in advance with the Hitler Youth, who told him that they would have been happy to accompany the group and could have helped lead them safely out of the blizzard. He also suggested that any future British school trips to the Black Forest should reach out to the movement. But a letter to that official's boss said that the Germans were very sensitive about the case and quickly shut it down. Apparently, a French radio station blamed German authorities for being the reason for the tragedy, and the German government wanted to make sure that no official or citizen was held responsible in any way whatsoever. The Strand School and the London County Council also didn't want to be put in the position of having to explain how poorly planned the trip was and why it was allowed for one teacher to be in charge of 27 boys. And while the committee did investigate, it was a halfway investigation. They didn't really ask anything that they should have asked to get answers. And they said that any charges against Keast were withdrawn. Later on, they told him to cancel the school skiing trip to Austria that he was planning 8 months from the Black Forest disaster. But that could have happened because of the 2-day meeting with the education committee that they used to investigate the disaster, where Jack Sr. tore into the school's headmaster and the older boys that he accused of failing to help the little ones. Jack Sr. also confronted Keast at the school gates to tell him to cancel the Austria trip. And so after all of that, Keast was forced to write to the parents that agreed to let their sons go on the trip and tell them that it was canceled. Keast would later say that it left him feeling finished and aimless, and that it seemed like the school and the council were completely under Jack Sr.'s thumb. And Jack Sr. was relentless because he harassed Keast at work, at his parents' house where he lived. I mean, it was to the point where Keast was about to crack and make a criminal complaint. One time he even wrote that if Jack Sr. bothered him one more weekend, he would assault him, and figured if he murdered Jack Sr., it would be the best way to end his misery. Jack Sr. once approached a student from the Strand School and berated him for wearing the uniform of the school that killed his son. That student wasn't involved in Black Forest at all. And outside of his business, he had a plaque that said, "I charge Keast with my son's death." And the day his son was supposed to turn 16, Jack Sr. was arrested. He laid wreaths at Keast's door and stood outside yelling, "My son has been murdered," wearing a black armband. He was so devastated, and his wife was too. They moved after their son passed because the house that they were in had too many memories. They turned their new home into a shrine for their son, filling it with pictures of him and placing his sports gear around the home. The new house was also closer to the cemetery where Jack Jr. was buried. 2 years after losing Jack, the Eatons had a daughter that they named Jacqueline. Jack Sr. never got the investigation that he wanted, so I'm not sure if he truly found peace. There are reports he died in a psychiatric hospital, but I haven't been able to find the records of that, so I don't know how true that information is. As for Keast, he eventually switched schools a few years after the disaster and then became headmaster somewhere else, before records of him are no longer found. But I found an article written by someone saying they're a former student of his that said Keast finished his career at Marlborough College. It's a public school in England that teaches kids aged 13 to 18. The student said Keast taught A-level German, and he had absolutely no idea of Keast's past. He was actually surprised to read that Keast openly disliked Germans. Kenneth Keast died in 1971. The former student ended his article with a question. He asked, how could a teacher who led a group where the students died be able to continue teaching? And that same idea was questioned just a few months prior to that article, because on the 80th anniversary of the Black Forest disaster, a group of villagers met at the place where the boys stayed the night after being rescued. The teacher and historian who stumbled onto the story and spent a decade researching it said that as a teacher, he wouldn't have been able to live with himself if it happened to him, and he would have thrown it in after that. And I agree. I mean, I've been coaching gymnastics on and off for many years, and I just can't wrap my head around my kids having something like that happen to them, let alone being the reason for it. Not that we would be in that situation at all. And I say my kids as in my athletes, because in the gym, they are my kids. I'm responsible for their safety and happiness and learning and everything else. And I'm sure if any of you are listening and you're a teacher or a coach, you feel the same. One of the villagers at the meetup was the grandson of someone involved in the rescue. And he said, to this day, everyone is shocked at how lightly dressed the boys were. Nobody in the village even lets their kids outside without at least a hat on in April. The daughter of one of the boys rescued said her father didn't really talk about what happened, but he did tell her about the kindness of the villagers and how they helped him without thinking about their own safety. And it's believed the only reason her father even survived long enough to be rescued was because he brought a bike cape that he took from his father for the journey. He was only 4 feet tall at the time and one of the smallest in the group, but he was able to wrap it around his body to try and keep warm. Today, there are 2 sculptures remembering the disaster, one that the villagers were originally part of before Hitler took it over and had someone make a huge gateway on the mountainside over Hofsgrund. It has 2 stones standing up with a 3rd stone lying on top and connecting both. The 2 stones standing up have the names of the boys inscribed. The one on top has Nazi symbolism. The whole thing is made of Black Forest granite. When Germany and Britain went to war, it ruined the inauguration plans. They were going to have the royal family and other British officials come, but after the war started, German officials wanted to tear it down several times, but they never got around to it. The parents of the boys made their own memorial too, and it's the only one where the villagers are thanked for what they did. It's in the entrance to the village church. And not even a year after the disaster, Jack Sr. had a sculpture created for his son. It's a cross that looks like a gravestone, and it's made of Black Forest granite. It sits on the mountainside in the spot where Jack Jr., Peter Ellerkamp, and Stanley Lyons died. There's an inscription on it, and Jack Sr. wanted to include, "Their teacher failed them in the hour of trial." But German officials vetoed that, so where that line is supposed to be, it's just blank. The villagers paid for Jack's memorial to be made, and I think it says a lot that he wanted to do a separate one for his son. The villagers involved in the rescue said, decades later, their memories of the Englishmen's misadventure were as fresh as the day it happened. Stay safe, and see you next Thursday.